Good morning, everyone. Tim, alcoholic, and also Al-Anon, date of sobriety 24th of July 1993. Been in Al-Anon almost as long. Um, Now, we're going to be talking about step 9, but I can't assume that everyone who's here has a full background to the preceding steps. The step has a meaning only in its context. So each step doesn't exist on its own as a separate project. It's part of a bigger project. The best way to find out the point of any step is to look at the first step, which is where we're coming from, and look at the last step, which is where we're going to. And the journey in between is explained by the starting point and the end point. The starting point is that as an alcoholic, I have a catastrophic weakness, which is that my mind will get me to act in a way which will kill me, which will kill my physical body and make my life misery while it's doing it. The nature of my alcoholism is that drink will seem like a good idea. Periodically, there are times when it seems like a terrible idea. Those are not the times that are the problem. The times that are the problem are the moments that drink seems like a good idea. If the problem is food, if the problem is sex, the principle is still the same. The 99% of the time, you know that binge eating or having inappropriate sex or drinking or drugging is a bad idea. Those are not the problem. It's the 1% of the time that they seem not a problem. That is the trap door that one falls through. And once one is in the other side, in the upside down world, I don't want to come back. When I'm drunk, I don't want to come back. I want to stay there forever. It's only by accident I end up sober. So I must never fall through the trap door. However, the trap doors are there. This isn't a religious program, but it is informed originally by religions. We can't help that. There we go. That's the history. So disliking that won't change it. At the center of this is essentially a religious idea, which is that God is the answer. Now, how one construes God is one's own business. There's no specific belief associated with a particular religion there, but I'm afraid, and as I said, one doesn't have to like it, but God is at the center of this. And one of the images, if I dare quote one of the Psalms, is of from Psalm 91 of the angels lifting you up so that your feet don't strike a stone on the ground. And that is what step 12 does. It lifts me up so that instead of walking on the trap door and falling through to the other world, I'm lifted over it. What that means very practically is that it's now only very rarely that the thought of a drink occurs to me. And if it does, it is harmless. It has no effect. It doesn't activate the mechanism. The car key is there, but it doesn't get inserted into the port. The car doesn't get turned on. So I'm safe. Where am I safe? I'm safe in step 12. What is step 12? It involves three things: a spiritual awakening, which I guess we'll cover in step 12. The short version of which is there is more to the universe than meets the eye. In fact, the real universe cannot be seen. And if you want a good example of this, explain to me why a sunset appears more beautiful to you than a pile of rubbish. The photons hitting your eyes are the same photons, but in one case they're beautiful, in another case they're not. And it's got nothing to do with this has got nothing to do with evolution or being taught that. We know that one is more beautiful. Why? The answer does not lie in the material world. The answer lies in a knowledge which lies beyond the material world that tells us this is beautiful and that isn't. Um, Having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps, we uh, try to carry this message to other alcoholics and to practice these principles in all our affairs. So the solution is to be in the service of God 24 hours a day. Now, to serve God can mean to simply sit back and appreciate what is. So one doesn't have to be busy scrubbing the floor to be serving God or squawking about the steps to be serving God. One can serve God by simply appreciating what is given. So when someone gives you a gift, the way you serve them back is by saying thank you and looking pleased with the gift, even if you're not pleased with the gift. You show that you're pleased with the gift. So the middle steps are to take us from the position of being in charge of one's life with catastrophic consequences to being in a position where we are serving God. And the position that step 9 occupies in that sequence, the roles it plays, well, there are several roles. The first one, in order to cook a meal in a kitchen effectively, the kitchen has to be clean and clear. All of the things have to be put away. If it's full of all the dirt from yesterday and the guacamole dish from yesterday and the nachos and whatever else is around there, you'll struggle to make a good meal. So the kitchen needs to be cleared for good work to be done. Any chef knows that. So steps 4 through 9 do the clearing, and they clear in two ways. First of all, they clear the mind, and then they clear the practical relationships with others. Whilst apologies are not given, people remain untrustworthy. I can't tell you how often I've experienced this particular phenomenon in my life, where Bobby will behave very badly towards Sally. And Sally says, well, I forgive Bobby. Of course I forgive Bobby, and I'm happy to work with him. He just needs to acknowledge that what he did was wrong, and then we can move on. But without that, there's a great big lie in the room, which is that what he did was okay. Unless that lie is cleared out of the way, we can't proceed. And I feel this very strongly myself in my relationships with other people. I can't proceed if there is an unamended wrong. I'm hesitant to trust people properly who have not admitted their fault if the fault is grievous or grave. So for those relationships to function, the apology needs to take place. And if there is further restitution to be made, if there are further actions to be taken to undo the harm, usually there aren't, but if there are such actions, they must be taken. What this does, it reopens the channels between me and all of the other people in my life. And this places me in a position where I can be maximally useful to other people. There are also many spiritual reasons why the amends have to be completed. So I'm already going to get into one of the thorny questions of steps 8 and 9. So step 8 talks about making a list of all people we had harmed, all of them. So unless the list contains all of them, it hasn't been done. Then it says in step 9, made amends to such people. Such people refers back to the phrase all people. So step 9, you can read step 9, made amends to all people we had harmed. And the step isn't completed until all elements are completed. The best analogy for this is a train journey to Edinburgh. If you undertake a train journey to Edinburgh and you pass through only 11 out of the 12 intermediary stations, where you end up may be very pretty. It may indeed be in Scotland. but it won't be Edinburgh. It'll be somewhere else. Until I'd completed step 9, until I'd completed step 9, I'd got some of the benefits, but the step hadn't been done. And it's very, very common. Whenever I, as it were, question someone who comes to me after a relapse after many years of recovery, one of the questions I always ask is, did you complete amends? And I get two answers. The first answer is no. That has the merit, at least, of being honest. The second answer I get is yes, absolutely. Then I say, how many amends did you make? And they say, both of them. And you think, look, I just don't believe that you went through your life and you negatively affected, you damaged the relationships with only two people. Just, it's not credible. As an alcoholic, although there was misbehavior, I was relatively well behaved. In my first 16 years of recovery, I was relatively well behaved. And yet between those two sequences of events, there were hundreds of situations to rectify. And I was a goody two shoes. So if you were a scoundrel or a cad, then there are going to be far more than that. There's a lot to be done. There's a lot to be done. Tom W. talks about if you knock at the gates of heaven, say, can I be let in? God will say, you need to go and clear, you're very welcome, but you need to clear up your mess first. And you say, can't I just come in for a few minutes first? And God says, no, clean up your mess, then you can come in. House rules. One could talk for an eternity on the spiritual purposes of step 9, but I'm just going to give a couple. The first one is this. The ego is my idea of me as a separate individual. It says, I'm not part of humanity. I'm not part of the universe. I'm my own man. There's that phrase in the language, a self-made man. I've made myself. I wasn't made by the universe. I've made myself. And now I've made myself. I must make something of myself. And I become concerned with a number of things in support of that project. I become concerned with what I think of me. You have 17-year-olds saying, I don't know who I am. It's the big question. Unfortunately, you still get 30-year-olds saying that, as though it's a question which has an answer. But I get concerned with who I am. I get concerned with what other people think about me. I actually think about what other people think about me as though I can work it out. I get concerned with my position in the world, with achievement in the world, with purpose. What's the point of my life? Was the question that I would ask, as if, again, I would be in a position to determine that. It's like a cell of the body saying, what's the purpose of me? How would you know? You're a cell of the body. Even if you're a brain cell, you're not the whole brain. How could a single brain cell know the purpose of the person that is operating through that body? That's the senselessness of those questions of identity. And it's very popular, very fashionable these days to be very concerned with identity and attaching lots of labels as though those labels tell you anything at all, as though they mean anything, and as though they tell you anything at all. This is the ego. Now, as soon as I set myself up as this separate being, part of me knows I've betrayed the group. So imagine you're singing in a choir and you suddenly start doing a solo that no one asked you to sing. You know that you're not reading from the same hymn sheet as everyone else. You're spoiling the project. And in doing so, there is guilt. Now, If I recognize, you see, my ego, it has a self-preservation instinct. Once it's been created, it wants to preserve itself. And so the last thing it wants me to do is to realize I've made a mistake. I need to go back a stage and undo that desire to be separate, reintegrate with the whole. Poof goes the ego. For it to survive, I have to not go back. If I feel guilty and I realize the reason I feel guilty is because I've set myself up as this separate being, I'll think, I don't want that. I don't want to be separate and special if it means feeling guilty and frightened. Fear always comes with guilt. But as soon as you're guilty, you're frightened that you're going to be punished. I don't like this fear and guilt. I just would rather be one of the crowd if I can get rid of the fear and the guilt just by being one of the crowd, by being the singer in the choir who stops trying to do his descant over the top of angel realms of glory. Uh, if I stop doing that and just become a singer in the choir, I'll be okay. So the ego has to find a way of me not recognizing that that is the reason I feel guilty. And it has two mechanisms. The first mechanism is resentment. Resentment is when I sense the guilt, but I locate it in you. Have you ever got up in the morning, you think you're okay, you're having a nice breakfast, you have your little shower, you have your first cup of coffee, your second cup of coffee, your third cup of coffee, your fourth cup of coffee, you feel slightly sick, and then you go and leave the house and you discover that the universe has been populated with arseholes. Everyone's an arsehole. Objectively speaking, it's not a matter of opinion, they just are. But you're very spiritual now, so you're going to look on them as sick people and tolerate them. Very nice, very good. You're seeing your own guilt, but you're locating it in someone else. So that's the first thing. By the time you got to step 9, with any luck, you've gotten over a lot of the resentment. There are lots of exercises to undertake per the big book, page 67. Ask your sponsor or your pharmacist for more information about either of those. One of those would be considerably more useful than the other, but there we go. You get over the resentment, and what you're left with is your own guilt. And if I have unfinished amends, the ego says, "Aha, we knew it. You're the jerk after all." And all of the guilt, it's imagine you've got 100 amends to make. And you've got this bucket of guilt, this sort of underlying guilt for running around as a separate person, destroying the unity of the choir, the harmony. Got all this guilt. The guilt is spread over those 100 amends. You make one of the amends, and I've had this in so many amends conversations. The guilt in relation to that situation goes, even if the other person doesn't forgive me. And I've had amends where they shout at me for 20 minutes until they're done. Even then, the guilt in relation to that situation is gone. What the guilt does, it says, right, we've got 99 amends left. Let's just regroup in the other 99. And eventually you whittle them down until there's one left. And all of the guilt, the only place it has to hide is that one last amend. When the last amend is made, the ego has nothing left. We can't point the guilt at anyone else. There is nothing I've done. I then say back to my ego, as I remember saying very clearly at 16 years sober, which is the first time I finished every single last amend thoroughly. First time through, I did a reasonable job, but I skirted some things. I found ways round certain things. It wasn't as deep as it could have been. It wasn't as searching as it could have been, but I did it reasonably sincerely. Second time, very, very thorough. It was actually 15 years sober. Finished the last amend. I thought, oh my God, there is literally nothing wrong with me. I'm fine. There was nowhere left for my ego to hide. And I felt at one with everything. Poof, the whole thing was gone. Now, that moment is like a flash of lightning in a stormlit night, a stormy night, where the night, the landscape gets lit up for one moment and you see everything. Then you spend the rest of your time trying to mentally recover what you saw in the moment when the lightning flashed. So that sort of sense of oneness, it comes and it goes. Sometimes I have it, sometimes. But there is nowhere left for my guilt to hide. So when it comes back, I can say, right, the reason I'm having this is because I'm in a state of separation, conscious separation. I need to stop trying to build a me in the world and just serve God instead. Lose myself in serving God. Doesn't matter doing what, just do something. Got to get out of my head, out of my so-called thinking, because it's not thinking, it's white noise with words. There's a difference between words and thinking, just FYI. Just because words are running through your head does not mean you're thinking, it just means your brain is producing words. So the point of step 9, in so many ways, is to place me in a position where there is nowhere for the ego to hide, and I can return and be at one with other people, with the universe, with God, with nature, with everything. There's one little feedback loop I want to talk about with 8 and 9 as well. If I feel guilty about a particular thing, my mind goes to work to justify why it was okay, why I did the bad thing. And the best way to justify why it was okay to do the bad thing is to say the person was a jerk anyway, they had it coming. Remember that musical Chicago where all of these women who are in prison for killing their husbands, they sing, he had it coming. That's the ego. So that's that little feedback loop. So resentment and guilt for unfinished amends, they go in a loop, round and round and round. And one reinforces the other. It's a vicious circle. You cut one side and you can start to work on the other. So by the time we get to step 9, we have made a jolly good list of all the people we've negatively affected. That's what harm means. It means to negatively affect something. If in doubt, understand a big book term broadly. So in step 4, the resentment inventory, don't chop off the 100 subsidiary forms of upset and say, well, I'm only going to write about specific forms of grievance, but not all of the anger. Anger's all right. Disappointment's all right. Envy's all right. Jealousy is just real resentment. Understand it broadly. Because the big book switches terminology. Harm and injuries, same thing. Except when to do so would injure them or others. Take injury to be a synonym of harm. Each word refers to the whole cloud of meaning. So there's a technical term, resentment means any negative upset about stuff going on. Harm, any negative impact. So I've got a thorough list in step 8. Now, there is no, as it were, materiality threshold, I don't think, in step 8. If any of you are auditors, you'll know this term, the materiality threshold. If you're not, I'll have to explain it. Auditors go into a firm to identify whether its financial records and financial reporting are complete and accurate. And when you always find things wrong, but they only bother making a change to the accounts if the mistake is big enough to distort the picture of the firm as a whole. And this is called the materiality threshold. It might be 1%, it might be 2%. Now, the step 8 must be a full review of all of the harm. But with step 9 is essentially a series of conversations with people with remedial action, action which remedies the harm, action which makes up for the harm in some cases, but chiefly it's a set of conversations. Now, if you were to go back to Sally and say, well, in 1974, I should have opened a door for you, but it didn't. I didn't open the door for you. It was inconsiderate and I shouldn't have done it. She'll think you're a crackpot. And she would be right. You would be a crackpot to go back for that. So there is a threshold above which a conversation with someone is due. There are situations which are so trivial that it would be grandiose to go back and try to make amends for them. It would take up people's time. It would actually cause a problem in the relationship because now, in addition to whatever they think about you, they now think you're a moralizing prig and have no sense of perspective or reason, that you completely lack common sense. So there's got to be some sound judgment here. Everyone will fall on one side or the other. I'm someone that tends to minimize, so I make more amends than I think I need to. A lot of people are the other way around. They overemphasize the harm they have inflicted on others and make amends where it's not necessary at all. One needs to find out through experience which side of that line one is on. So if you make 10 amends and all of them say 2 right, that was really bad behavior, thanks for making amends. And that's the response from 10 of them. There are probably another 10 you've missed. If you make 10 amends and 2 of them say, absolutely, that was a wicked thing you did, thank you for making amends. The other 6 of them say, oh, I remember, but don't worry about it. That, by the way, that means thank you for making amends. When they say don't worry about it, they mean you did the right thing. It doesn't mean you didn't harm them. That's just a polite way of responding graciously to an amend. Doesn't mean you made a mistake in making amends. And then 2 out of 10 are completely baffled that you're doing it. Not bothered, just baffled. If that is the case, you're probably getting it about right because you're covering, you've gone you have to go a little bit beyond what you think is necessary to make sure you catch everything. I'll tell you why. There are going to be situations where I remember something many years ago. A friend of mine, I had him round to dinner with some other friends. I was sober a few years, maybe 5 years sober. And he was drunk and he was really rude, not an AA member, very rude to the other dinner guests. It was just ruining the evening. And I made amends. What I had to do in that evening was I had to get rid of him basically. So we called a cab, we found a way of getting him outside, and we pushed him into the cab, and that was the end of it. Now it needed to be done. It wasn't the most elegant thing to do, but we never spoke about it after that. But when I came to an amends round, I did bring that up and say, I basically acknowledged that it was a difficult situation, and we talked about it. And that I didn't handle it as graciously as I should have, frankly. It needed to be done. He recognized it needed to be done as well, but it was the way it was done was not great. And he said, don't worry about that. Within a couple of days, I realized I'd been a jerk and blah, 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 so it was fine. I said, is there anything else? He says, there is actually. And he recalled a comment that I'd made that I thought was hysterical and everyone else thought was hysterical, but he'd been really hurt by it. It was a trivial comment, but for some reason it hit a nerve with him. So there are there are situations where one has harmed someone, where one thinks it's trivial and the other person doesn't, which means that with step 8 and 9, with step 9, you go a little bit beyond what you think is necessary just to be sure. You do, like when you're proofreading, you do an extra check. Only if it comes through completely clean are you definitely done. The actual step 9 itself, the mechanics of the step 9 are very, very straightforward. One doesn't have to do this elegantly. You get hold, so you first of all, you get hold of the person. Now, if you're in regular or at least ongoing contact with someone, you might not have spoken to them for a year, but they are someone you might conceivably speak to. So people where there is a live relationship, even if the line isn't like a telephone line, need not be used to be a live telephone line. If there is a live channel of communication, just call them up or go and see them. Or there are innumerable situations. It might be a priest in a church. You just drop by for the Sunday service and go and talk to them afterwards or before the service. Probably afterwards anyway. But the point is, if you've got a live relationship, you can just grab them. If you don't, it's very presumptuous and intrusive to call up or appear physically unbidden, particularly if you've done something, because they're going to be on the defensive. I personally, I mean, I'm an extremely introverted, quiet person. Someone once asked me, what do you find intrusive? And I said, being addressed, being asked questions like that. So I don't particularly appreciate being contacted out of the blue by people I'm not in an ongoing relationship, except in the context of AA and Al-Anon. If someone wants help, anyone can call me, that's fine. But in terms of those other, I'm not keen on it. I would rather be approached with a little message saying, this is my business, can I talk to you? And so when I'm making amends to people I don't have an ongoing relationship with anymore, I approach them in writing, and you can do one or two things. You can either put the amend in writing and say, I'd love to talk about this. I'd be very happy to talk about this if you would like to discuss any of this. If not, I wish you well on your journey and blah, blah, blah. Or you can say, I'd like to make amends. Would there be a time we could speak or meet? Or failing that, I will send you a letter. Important thing, a lot of people don't respond to attempts to make amends to them. And what one doesn't want to do is pester people unnecessarily with these endless requests to make amends. So you don't want more than 2 shots. So the first shot, you say, dear Susan, you may remember me from Heidelberg in 1989. I did X, Y, and Z. I'd like to make amends for this. If you could give me a number I could call you on, that would be great. If not, I'll just send the thing through in writing in a couple of weeks. Feel free not to read it. There's no obligation. And then 2 weeks later, if you've heard nothing, you send a letter, then you're done. If you know it's got through, there are different channels of communication. With some, you can tell whether it got through. If it's email and it bounces, you will get notified that it bounced. If it doesn't bounce, it got through. It's then their responsibility to check their email. I will sometimes, if it fails once, if the message has definitely got through and the letter has been sent, but I hear nothing, it will stay on the list. I may give them another go a year later and say or sometimes you come across them in a different channel, in a different situation. I've sometimes followed up again, and I've sometimes got a response the second time, where I didn't get the response the first time. I remember one particular chap, didn't respond. I found him on a different channel, 3 or 4 years later. I made amends. He said, yeah, I wasn't ready then, but I'm ready now. So, give it to me. And gave him the amends, and we're friends now. So it is worth giving it a second go, even if you've sent it through and done it properly the first time. But give it a year or two, maybe. It goes with the people that I can't find, or where the loose ends are not tied up. I keep a list of those, and once a year or so, I run through the list and try and retrace them, because who can be traced and how is constantly changing because of the internet, of course. And in fact, there was someone I was trying to trace for 28 years from when I lived in, I went to school in Germany, from when I lived in Germany. And something new was published on the internet, which made reference to him 20 years ago, with a double-barreled surname, which represented a transition. He transitioned from having one surname to another surname. He'd started out with a surname from one branch of the family. He switched over time to having a surname from a different branch of the family. And there was a little period in between, sort of interregnum, where he was using a double-barreled surname, but he didn't stick with that. He switched to the other barrel. And publication, this new publication gave me the clue that was missing, which was the link between the old surname and the new surname. And I found him. And amazingly, my other half and I stayed with him in Vermont this summer for a week. Um, it's worth keeping going with these things. So once a year, you revisit it, go down the list. And I actually paid an agency to find him in this situation. So sometimes you have to pay good actual money to find people. Stop at nothing. Stop at nothing. And even in the last 3 or 4 years, I found 3 or 4 people actually that have been knocked off the list. I've got very, very few left. The ones that are left, uh, with one of them, I discovered only a year ago. I did some genealogy tracing, and the reason I couldn't find him is because his surname he gave me at the time was not real. And I found who he purported to be was not who he purported to be. So now I just have a first name, even if that may not itself be real. But you find things out. It's amazing what you can find out, but there's very little left. But I have done my utmost. The line in the big book is this: we do our utmost to straighten out the past. When I've done everything I can, I'm clean, I'm free. It's over to the universe now. When approaching someone, however they say they want to hear the amends, you go with it. Don't dick them around. Don't enter into a dialogue which goes back and forth 47 times. Just get it done, be compliant, go with it. I'll tell you a little story. A while ago, someone came to me to make amends for a very trivial thing from many years ago, recovery related. And he told me what the thing was in the approach. So, yeah, good boy, well done. And he said, I want to apologize for doing X, Y, and Z. I said, oh, very nice. Thank you. Good to hear from you. Thank you very much. And he said, I'd like to come to your home group to do it in person. And I thought, oh, do I want to see this person? I don't know. I can't remember their face. I sort of know vaguely who they might, but it's that kind of thing. It's not like we were best buddies or something. Anyway, he's got this idea that it needs to be person. When it's a directly, it doesn't mean in person. Often that comes out of the wash in person. The phrase in person was available in 1938, yet it wasn't used. So directly, the book talks about writing people letters on occasion. Directly means directly. That means to the person, not just by generally being nice. That's the sense of directly. You communicate directly with the person. Often, it's only in writing that you can effectively get the message across without being contradicted or diverted. And if it's in writing, they get to reread it as many times as they need to understand the words that you're actually saying. Most people, when you speak to them orally, they don't hear what you're saying. It's being interpreted and distorted in the moment of saying, and what they come away with at the end of it is a distorted version of the message. So in writing is a very good way of making amends and doing it clearly. Anyway, back to the story. I said to him, there's really no need to travel up from, it was another county. I mean, it's not like he was around the corner. There's no need to travel up from so and so to, basically make a day trip of it for this. You no need to do that. Just send me a little note saying what you need said. It's absolutely fine. But he insisted. Okay, he insisted, and I made the mistake of saying, "Oh, okay then." And I said, "Well, this is my home group." And then he said, "Well, I can't be there this Saturday." And so we entered into this sort of round of, when am I going to be there? When is he going to be there? I said, I'm going to be away for 3 weeks. And he said, well, I'll come when you're back. And I thought, I'm now left in a position of having to perpetually tell him whether or not I'm going to be there on each Saturday in order to avoid him wasting a journey up to. No, this whole thing is already inconvenienced me more than the very trivial thing from 10, 15 years ago. So I said, let's keep this simple. If you, thank you very much, but just send me a note. If you want to say something, just put it in a note. That'd be absolutely sufficient. He never sent the note. So this the object lesson is how not to do it. What would I have done if I'd been in his position? So point one, write to the person first. So you want to make amends. When the person says, send me a note, you do what they say. Just do what they say, because you're presuming to have their time by making amends. Very few people want to make a big production number out of it. Also, when you're approaching people to make amends, never say, no, remember me? And you're the one that like peed on their bed at a party in 1993. Um, uh, hey, do you remember me? I'm the one with the wild eyes. Can we meet for coffee? Don't do that. Uh, Tell them what you're doing. Tell them why you're doing it. If what you did drunk or during your drinking years, tell them you're now sober, or they won't believe a thing. If you did what you did when you were sober, do not mention recovery. Say, I'm going through a process of systematically assessing where I've affected other people negatively and going around trying to make it right with people. And you're one of the people I've affected. Um, be very careful about the I'm in a 12-step program, blah blah blah, and do I won't get over my drinking unless I do my utmost to straighten out the past. Don't take 1930s language, drop it into 2020 and think it's going to go down. It will go down like a bucket of cold sick. Uh, I think Americans are much more open to the language, the British much less so. Someone went in with that big book language to an amend, and the person said back to them, oh, you're doing that, are you? What am I? Number 47 on the list. You're 5 years sober. Took your time, didn't you? People know a lot more now than they did then. So you've got to be careful mentioning the whole AA thing. If you're more than a year sober and you're making amends for something you did drunk, you're late. So you've got to mention that. You've got to say, this is not only have I treated you badly, I've been very slow in admitting it to myself and doing the right thing by coming to you. Preempt that. Don't try to get a gold medal for doing something 18 years after the event that you should have done the next morning, because you won't get a gold, you will not get a gold medal for that. You fall on your sword and say, I should have done this a long time ago. The actual conversation itself is very, very straightforward. You say why you're there, particularly if it's exes and so on. You've got to make it clear that you're not there to relight the fire in any way. You're not there for money. You're not there for any reason other than to admit you're wrong and then to wish them well and as they go on, as you go your separate ways. You say what you did wrong. Do not go into the internal state of mind. It only ever makes things worse. It only ever makes you seem more of a jerk. They're not interested either. And anyone that is should not be told the answer because they're spoiling for a fight. The only exception to this is if something was thought to have been done out of malice, but it was merely carelessness, then that's worth saying. But otherwise, they don't want a ringside seat to your own amateur pop psychology self psychoanalysis. They do not want that. So don't give it to them. Um, uh, I saw a meme of it was a picture of broken egg, and it said how to apologize, and there were three options. The first two were crossed out. The third one had a tick, and it was a broken egg. And the first one said, "I didn't intend to break the egg." No, don't say that. The second one was something about, "I'm really going to try hard not to break the egg next time." The right thing to say, "I broke the egg. That's it. I did it, and I shouldn't have done it, and I regret doing it. What can I do to make this right?" And then the conversation flows from may or may not flow from that. I've had immense conversations which lasted for 3 hours. Um, uh, I've had others which last a minute. Just because it's a minute doesn't mean it hasn't been done properly. If you pay a check for £100,000, it takes a minute to process, but it makes a big difference. So the magnitude spiritually of the event is not in proportion to its duration. The conception of a child can take a moment, but it has an effect for decades. Uh, it's the fact of the act which matters. So you don't need to make a big production number out of it. If you've watched too much television, then I'm sure you've seen these. I don't really mean to be mean to the Americans, but these American films where people have these very sort of pathetic, soppy reconciliations between family members where everyone weeps and they hold each other's hands and go and sit by the lake and they say all the things that they should have said 20 years ago. And there are all sorts of brick drops and mic drops and all those other wonderful things. If you're British and you make amends to your parents, you're much more likely to be walking along the dairy aisle of Waitrose and saying to your father, "I'm so sorry for what I did," and X, Y, and Z. And he'll say, "Son, don't worry about it. Everything's fine." And it's done by the time you've got to the yogurt. Just because it's low key doesn't mean it hasn't been done properly. In fact, all of the stuff and nonsense, all of the big performance is often a sort of an embarrassment, really, to hide the real thing, which is the simple amend. It doesn't need to be elegant. It needs to be done. My old sponsor, Brian, uh, he talks about his friend Val, who dealt with a a very tricky family incident. And Val said about, I don't know, I think I know who Val is vaguely, so I'm just reporting something very third hand. But she said, "I did it, I dealt with it. I wouldn't give you tuppence for how I dealt with it, but I dealt with it." And I think that's a very good description of step 9. It doesn't have to be done well, but it does need to be done. It's always going to be embarrassing. It's always going to be awkward. Um, Trying to think if there's anything else major on this. Um, yeah, I'm going to mention something about finances. Actually, except when to do so would injure them or others. I'll do that first. Except when to do so would injure them or others. Essentially, first of all, you remember that step 9 is a conversation. So to consider the question, how could the conversation injure, cause harm to them or others? You're asking the question, how could a conversation cause harm to them or others? And frankly, there are very few ways. If I harmed someone and they were harmed, if I took an action, a harmful action, and they were harmed, they know about it because it is in the nature of harm to know of the harm that has been done. If you don't know something, it hasn't yet harmed you, it is a potential harm. There are situations where reputation can be harmed, but you aren't aware of it and it's affecting you without your knowledge. But that's a relatively minor point, really. But it stands to reason, therefore, that it's very difficult in a step 9 to find a situation where you're saying something the person doesn't already know, because it was them it was done to. So this exception, except when to do so would injure them or others, it's vanishingly rare that it bites, that it actually kicks in, this exception. The situations where it does happen, first of all, it's chiefly to do with revealing new information. An example would be a theft. A friend of mine, when he was working at a hotel, he and another employee in cahoots with each other thieved, I don't know, £1,000 from the hotel one way or another. The hotel would have known, but it wouldn't have known who and how. Now, to do with the way he would have had to have broached this topic, there's no way he could have done it without the collusion of another person. And she was not going to be making amends for this. She was not going to be admitting this. So he couldn't go and say, I did this, because they'll then know, aha, so someone else helped you with this. And the question would start being asked, who? And he couldn't do that without her permission. So he had to find another way. So crimes where they know it was done, but they don't know who. That's essentially the main situation in which you might have to find another way. Getting a criminal record, or at least activating a criminal process, is another situation where, although one is in principle happy to go down, as they say, for a crime, the fact is, if you activate prosecution, you are causing harm to the time and resources of the agencies that are then forced to deal with it. So it's let's say, it's very rare for supermarkets to prosecute or try to prosecute. I know of only one situation where the supermarket threatened to, it wasn't a supermarket, it was Marks and Spencer's actually, in London. It's a more general store. But that they started to take details in a rather suspicious way, and the person just cut the call. But generally, like Sainsbury's, Tesco's, I've never heard of people being prosecuted for trying to make amends to either of those two. I'm not saying it hasn't happened, but I do know of people who've admitted to crimes, gone to the police and said, it's a fair cop, it was me, Gov, and they, in making that amend, very well done, marvelous, spiritually, but you've now taken up police resources. You're taking up resources of the Crown Prosecution Service. You're taking up the time of the court. You're taking up the time of the probation service. And he, in fact, spent 2 years in prison for this. So how much did that cost the taxpayer? Some mug, or multiple mugs, had to work, probably in jobs that they didn't like, to pay for all of this so you could get your little spiritual release. No. Now, that's a general principle. There are going to be exceptions. Another similar one was where a friend of mine, his sponsee in Bristol, had defrauded the local authority. I think this local authority would have paid for housing benefit, or at least it was administered through the local authority. Anyway, he fiddled the housing benefit to the tune of £20,000 over a number of years. And the question was, does he find a way to make amends indirectly, or does he go to them and say, I've been defrauding the housing benefit service for 20 years? risking therefore prosecution, because these days, one thing which is different than the 1930s, things are very highly regulated today in a way that they weren't even 20 years ago, let alone 80, 90 years ago. Some organizations will have automated processes where at no one's discretion, they will have to start a prosecution because their internal procedures dictate that they must. Common sense won't have anything to do with how they respond. They are obliged to prosecute. Now, these people in Bristol came up with a very ingenious solution. They said, right, who has suffered from this chap defrauding the housing benefit? It is the council taxpayers of Bristol who have suffered. They are the ones that paid. The housing authority was merely the administrator of the system. The person ultimately harmed was the person paying for the housing benefit. Those are the people who are paying the council tax, the local taxation if they're not in the UK. So they went carefully to 10 payers of council tax and say, we're presenting you with this situation. Imagine there's someone that's defrauded Bristol Council of £20,000. They would like to make amends. Option A, they go and admit to the crime. They are prosecuted with all of these attendant costs and there is a fine and they pay the amount back. Or they pay the amount to housing charities in Bristol to help house people directly, £20,000 to housing charities that help house people directly in Bristol. All 10 taxpayers said B, not A. Not one of them thought it would be a good idea for the chap to be prosecuted because they all recognized this would do no good. It would be more costly to the system. You're really looking at exactly who is harmed. And with these corporate amends, the amend is not to the, like with a supermarket, the harm is not to the branch. The harm is to the shareholders of the supermarket. And sometimes people get very sort of political about this. Well, I don't believe in corporations. I'm an anarchist, something like that. So I'm not paying money to a corporation. But of course, a corporation is a legal fiction. What is behind that is your grandmother whose pension depends on shares in Tesco's. So if you're defrauding Tesco's, you're defrauding institutional investors, and behind those are ordinary folks who have their pensions and investments and savings in stocks and shares. That's who you're harming. It's not the institution. Now, you often will have to approach the institution to find a way of paying it back. But one must really consider this. This is not a question of knee-jerk dramatics. It's a question of undoing the harm in a way that levels up your account with the universe. Now, it's coming up to the hour. There's one question already. Someone asked, what about people who owe us an amends? Do we ever get to ask for an amends from a fellow, even if they are a sponsee? No, that's the end of that. It's their business. So any other, it's very easy. I like easy questions. Any other questions, just put your virtual hand up. If you don't want to be recorded, then put the question in the chat. Alistair.
Hi, Alistair, alcoholic. Tim, I had a question. One of the language we hear a lot in 12-step fellowships is about living amends. And actually, when you ask sort of certain questions, there's a great deal of different understandings of that word and what that actually means. Just wondered whether you would care to comment on living amends, whether it's applicable or and how how they might happen, sort of thing.
Okay. So just for the recording, I didn't plant Alistair to ask that question. Might be a suspicion. Okay, so the book doesn't refer to living amends. What the book does refer to, as far as I'm aware, the basic text doesn't. What it does say is that the amends take innumerable forms. Now, the actions which people often class as living amends, are simply behaving well towards the person in future. However, even if one had not harmed them in any way, one would be enjoined by steps 10, 11, and 12 to behave well to them anyway. That's what we've agreed to do by agreeing to live a spiritual program. So you're already supposed to be doing that. You don't get double credit by saying, well, the thing that I'm doing already, I shall double count that as making amends. Because what that does, it removes the amend. It means there are no amends at all by recasting the good behavior which is due as amends. Now, there are situations in which there is a form of living amend, and it's this. First of all, what one might do with someone is go above and beyond. So that, for instance, there might be an elderly relative where there is a small obligation, but you realize the family is not fulfilling their obligations. You have a particular uh, reason. You've already made the verbal amends, but you feel that there is more that should be done. So you go above and beyond the call of duty. So I think that would be a good example of a living amend where but it's not instead of the apology. It will be in addition to the apology. There are situations where this is a good example actually. Family uh, uh, thefts or minor thefts or accepting gifts from family members or essentially which were then spent on drinking and drugging, where um, they don't want the money back, but you quietly find a way to give them more back than you otherwise would have. You have an eye on that for the rest of your life. But the trouble is the reason I'd avoid the phrase, well, first of all, it's not necessary because it covers a whole range of other things, each of which has their own name and description. The danger is that it becomes one of the standard alternatives to say, well, no one wants the past raked up, so I shall just make living amends. And said, in 9 out of 10 cases, that is what people mean by it. And it's simply a way of avoiding having the conversation. Just to put to bed once and for all this idea of what sometimes people say that to make a particular amend would be to reopen an old wound. Now, the problem with that, that sounds very reasonable. If a wound is healed, you shouldn't reopen it. But the problem with that lies in the image which has been used. If I hurt someone 20 years ago and badly and never acknowledged it and never apologized, the wound hasn't healed. It is continuing to imagine if you've fallen and you've grazed your hand and it's full of grit and dirt. And 20 years later, it's never been cleaned. 20 years later, it's just festering, still full of the grit and dirt from 20 years ago. That's the image. The image here is not of a wound which has healed. The image is a wound which has never healed. So the making of the amends is the cleaning of the wound so it can actually heal. And if you've ever had a wound cleaned, you'll know that the cleaning hurts. But it doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. Just because someone will feel emotions, negative emotions, during the amend process, doesn't mean you're injuring them or causing them a new harm. This is a necessary part of the healing process. And I think the aversion to doing that is the addict desire never to feel anything under any circumstances except dopamine-induced joy. So one takes that philosophy and says, well, if someone else feels something, they shouldn't feel anything. So I mustn't make amends because someone might feel something. It's ridiculous. People are stronger than you think they are. And most other people aren't bothered at feeling things. It's only addicts who have a fundamental resistance to emotion. So this idea that just because it was a long time ago means you shouldn't make amends, or just because it was bad you shouldn't make amends is ridiculous. If they've gotten over it, they won't mind the amend. If they haven't gotten over it, yeah, they will feel emotion and it will come out. But that emotion is rattling around their unconscious the whole time anyway, having effects. And all the amend does is bring to the surface something which is already there, which is why this notion of except when to do so would injure them or others is all about introducing new information, which is what causes the new harm. And your three basic situations for causing harm, making amends, are revealing harms of which they weren't aware, placing yourself in a position where you cannot be useful to others. For instance, getting a criminal record and then being unable to get a visa to work in the country that people want you to work in, because that literally happens. And thirdly, don't involve a third party. So, Tenzing.
Hi, Tenzing Alcoholic. Thanks for the talk. So my question was, I have made a number of amends, and I'm currently going through the steps again. And I was wondering what your experience was when you mentioned that you had reached a moment where you had done quite a number of amends, but you hadn't completed them, which is basically where I am at. And my question is, sorry, trying to keep it clear, reviewing or thinking about some of the amends I've done, I think I have made mistakes in some of them, including when I offered to pay back money and I was told, no, it's fine. I was very happy and kind of just trotted along and didn't think about it anymore. So yeah, I was just curious what your experience was at that point where you had done a bunch of amends, but you hadn't completed them. Did you review some? Did you do some again? Did you, how did you process that?
If it's done, it's done. If the relationship is still stained or tainted, so if the person is still angry, huffy, cold, difficult towards you, there might be another conversation. If they're basically fine, if they're acting fine, there's nothing to mend there. So what one doesn't do is keep going back and doing it again and again and again to the same person. Do it once, do it properly, and then you're done. If you've done something new in the meantime, then go and apologize for that, but keep it low key. Someone's asked, I've gone through life apologizing for everything. Well, it won't be everything, but apologizing for many things. Okay. When talking about my program, a friend said the last thing you need to do is to apologize to me. My thinking is that now I understand better what I'm apologizing for. I need to do them properly. Does that sound right? I keep this very simple. If I owe someone amends, I write out my step 8, or rather, I write out my step 8 to determine whether or not I owe amends. I make the approach. Either they want to hear it or they don't. If they don't, that's the end of it. If they'll hear it, it's over in a minute. It's not a big deal. Just follow the standard procedure and the situation will give the answer. Manish. Or Manish isn't coming in, so Craig.
Thanks, Tim. When making your amends, did you ever get a sense of what impact the amends was having on the other person?
Well, it's a dangerous question because the impact in the moment is not the impact over time. So as I said, there have been amends where people have been absolutely furious at me. But then a few weeks later, they're all sort of smiles. So there's something that happens after the amend. You can't judge it by its impact in the moment. And other people, it's the other way around. It's all very emotional in the moment, and then they're cold afterwards. So you can't really tell. But But yeah, often there have been people have conveyed very profound impacts. But don't look for that. Don't look for that. Manish, let's give you another go.
See, as you said, my amends about my bosses. I was working in a company in project department, and I used to go to the job, and sometime I used to leave half a day. Sometime I used to not go, and my bosses did not know that whether I was on the job because I was on the project. So there was no chance that they were knowing about my being in company or my leaving half a day. So now it's a 25-old story. All are retired. So what do you suggest? Should I go and tell them that 25 years ago I used to take leaves without telling you, or I used to go home half a day, etc.? You are
Okay, that's a good question. A very good speaker on the topic of amends. I like him because he's a boring speaker. He just says what he wants to say and then he's finished. Paul Martin of Riverside, Illinois, dead now, a number of years. He died with over 60 years of sobriety. If I owe the amend, I must make it. Very simple. Now, except when to do so would injure them or others. You ask yourself, you put yourself in the shoes of the other person. I'm thinking, so I used to employ people many years ago. If one of them came to me and said, yeah, I was kind of fiddling the timesheets and I was would leave when you weren't there, I would leave early. I wouldn't be personally offended by that. One puts oneself in their shoes. If they would be genuinely hurt, then there might be a reason not to make the amend. But also here, you're considering whether it's your colleagues who really suffered or whether it's the organization which was paying you but wasn't getting a full day's work. So I think the step 8 needs more consideration. Very often, vagueness on step 9 is actually coming from vagueness on the step 8. One hasn't identified clearly who has suffered and how. Once you've identified that, it becomes much clearer what to do in step 9. And if in doubt on the injury, you place yourself in the shoes of the person who would be receiving the amend. Angelo.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Thank you for your share. My question is, like, especially with currently my step work and being in an S fellowship, I cannot really imagine, like, when it comes to making amends to people or ex-partners, that, I don't know, from a current perspective, I think there could be some, I don't know, injury to me myself, because the people themselves were part of my, like, addiction, the relationship. And you talked about like injuring corporations, but what are ways where I consider making an indirect amend when it comes to, like, ex-partners? Maybe you have some experience with that. Thanks. You're muted.
You don't consider the question of indirect amends until you've really completed the question of direct amends. So with relationships, or in the, are they relationships or are they entanglements? Anyway, let's call them relationships. These relationships one has had of an intimate nature. Very often, of course, the other person was as unwell as I was. Anyone who was well would have crossed the road to avoid me. So it is always the case with pretty much everyone I was in a relationship with during my drinking. They had issues. So the fact that they were very unwell is actually irrelevant. I'm just clearing up my side of things. I'm just admitting what I did wrong and saying I shouldn't have done it and I regret the impact that it had. That is it. The fact it's an X is neither here nor there. The only note of caution is one wants to do that, the amends to X's, with a respectful formality and with very clear fronted explanations about why one is doing what one is doing, in order that it not be seen as an attempt to, as I said earlier, relight the fire. And a lot of that has got to do with the wording. If it is worded correctly, then all danger is forfended. Often those amends are best done in writing in order not to reignite certain feelings. But there isn't a general rule with exes other than the general rule of step 9, which is make amends, except in those very rare circumstances where the revelation of new information would cause a problem. Rainford. Rainford, you've got a question?
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, hi. Yeah, so hi, Lynn Alcoholic. So I have a really sort of weird enmeshed sort of my husband's family, 3 daughters who have there's sort of a wall of mean girls, and they are all of a piece, and the whole family kind of is very enmeshed, and there's a lot of alcoholism, untreated Al-Anon, all that kind of stuff. And I've tried to we didn't see them for a long time during COVID, and they long story short, I've even tried to approach, and my sponsor even actually got to the point where she said, you know what, you tried at least with one, just you've done your part, leave it alone. But I haven't really tried to make amends individually, and I don't know exactly how to do it because there's 3 of them. I don't know how to approach one at a time because they're all going to talk amongst each other, and I would like to have each of them have their own experience hearing my amends, but I don't think that that's going to happen, and it's going to mess up the whole thing, because if I talk to one, then they're going to each talk amongst each other about what I said to them, and it's just
I'm going to stop you there. I've got the situation. I understand. Very good. Okay. So the first point is that in any relationship, I am responsible for my values, attitudes, beliefs, thinking, behavior, and feelings, and others are responsible for their values, attitudes, beliefs, thinking, actions, and feelings. They are none of my business. How they are going to react to this, as long as I'm approaching them with some consideration and tact, is none of my business. There's a legitimate question in there, which is about the order in which one makes amends when you've got a cluster of people. And the best thing to do, rather than trying to construct something, because you simply don't know what's going to happen. There are too many unknowns. Get all the approach letters prepared, send them all at the same time, and then duck. And either they'll say, yes, I will hear the amend, in which case you convey the amend, or they'll say no, in which case you will deploy part 2, which is to send the letters out. And what they do with the letters is their business, not yours, unless they wish to talk to you. And with very difficult people, when they want to share their response to the amend, my job is to listen and say yes a lot. And when they've finished, they've finished. And then I say, I'm going to go now. Have a nice rest of the day. But I don't have to engage in any of the stuff that comes back other than to acknowledge. And even if they're wrong, as it were, in their perception of my impact on them, if that is the world they're living in, that is the world they're living in. That's the thing that my action triggered even if it didn't create their insanity, it did trigger it. And so in one sense, a careless match in a very dry field, they're responsible for the conflagration because the field shouldn't have been dry, but it was my careless match that was dropped in it. So in a sense, they're right. With whatever they come back with, they're right because it is that is the universe they're living in. And I get to experience them expressing however they think I've affected them, even if I disagree, but I don't get into any argument. And this may not produce happy families, but it will produce a happy youth, which is a consolation prize at any rate. At least it frees the individual who's making the amends. So that's the end of questions. So if there's nothing else, do you want to stop the recording, Jason?